In a world where billionaires seem to operate above the law, what happens when a 22-year-old waitress decides one has finally crossed the line? This isn't a fairy tale. It's the story of Clara Lawson. A young woman armed with nothing but her integrity and the day she single-handedly took on the heir to the Thorn Empire in the middle of a busy New York diner. She expected to be fired, to be sued, to be crushed by the immense power she dared to challenge. What she never ever expected was what came next. Forget what you think you know about power and money. The real story, the one that unfolded behind closed doors and in the deafening silence of a private helicopter, is more shocking than you can ever imagine. The Gilded Spoon wasn't just a diner. It was a relic, a stubborn anchor of authenticity in the ever-changing tides of Lower Manhattan. Its checkered floors were worn from a century of footsteps. The vinyl on its booths was cracked like an old smile, and it smelled perpetually of strong coffee, sizzling bacon, and Maria's secret recipe apple pie. For Clara Lawson, it was more than a workplace. It was a sanctuary, a predictable rhythm of clattering plates and friendly chatter that stood in stark contrast to the chaotic symphony of her life outside its doors. At 22, Clara was carrying a weight far beyond her years. By day, she was a waitress, balancing orders with a grace that belied her exhaustion. By night, she was a student of architecture at Cooper Union. Her textbooks splayed across her tiny apartment, dreams of steel and glass rising from the pages. Every dollar she earned was split 3 ways: tuition rent, and the ever-growing pile of medical bills for her younger brother Liam, whose battle with a rare autoimmune disease was a silent, relentless storm in their lives. The Gilded Spoon, with its steady hours, and Maria's understanding eyes, was the one place she could breathe. That Tuesday began like any other. The lunch rush was a controlled chaos of tourists wanting a real New York experience, and regulars who had been eating at the same counter for 50 years. Clara moved through it all with unpracticed ease, her mind a complex Rolodex of who wanted their coffee black and who was allergic to onions. The bell above the door chimed, but this time it felt different. It wasn't the cheerful jingle of a regular or the curious tinkle of a tourist. It was a sharp, demanding sound, as if the door itself had been shoved open with contempt. In walked Julian Thorne. He wasn't just a customer. He was an event. Heir to the Thorne Global Properties, as fortune a name synonymous with half the skyline of New York, Julian moved with an aura of frictionless entitlement. He was handsome in a way that seemed machine-tooled perfect teeth, a jawline that could cut glass and eyes that scanned the room, not to see people, but to assess obstacles. He was flanked by 2 sycophants, Caden and Bryce, whose own expensive clothes seemed like costumes they wore to orbit his son. The diner's comfortable hum faltered. Heads turned. Whispers rippled through the booths. A table. Now Julian snapped, not at anyone in particular, but at the air itself, expecting it to comply. Maria, the diner's owner, and a woman whose 60 years had taught her to spot trouble from a mile away, started to move from behind the counter. But Clara, seeing the most desirable booth, was currently occupied by an elderly couple celebrating their anniversary, stepped forward. "Welcome to the Gilded Spoon," she said, her voice even and professional. "It will be just a few minutes for a booth, but we have space at the counter right now if you'd like." Julian's eyes landed on her, and it was like being examined under a microscope. He didn't look at her. He appraised her. A slow, dismissive scan from her worn-out sneakers to the slight fraying on her apron, lingering for a moment too long on her face and chest. "I don't do counters," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. He pointed a finger adorned with a heavy gold ring at the anniversary couple. "Get them out. I want that one." Caden and Bryce snickered. Clara felt a familiar hot spark of anger ignite in her chest. It was the same anger she felt when a professor dismissed her ideas, or when an insurance agent spoke about Liam's condition in terms of costs and liabilities. "Sir, those customers were here first," she said, her tone hardening just a fraction. "As I said, it will only be a few minutes. I can get you some drinks while you wait." "Did you not hear me?" Julian took a step closer, invading her personal space. His cologne, a sharp, eye-watering scent of sandalwood and arrogance, washed over her. "I said I want that table. Your job is to make it happen. Or are you as stupid as this place looks?" From across the room, Clara saw Chloe, a younger waitress who was still in high school, watching with wide, terrified eyes. She saw Maria's hands tighten on a dish rag. She saw the happy anniversary couple now looking uncomfortable, their quiet celebration spoiled. This man wasn't just a customer. He was a poison, seeping into the atmosphere of the one place she felt safe. Clara took a small, deliberate step back, reclaiming her space. "My job is to serve customers, not to throw them out for you. You will have to wait like everyone else." For a moment, Julian looked genuinely stunned, as if a piece of furniture had just spoken back to him. The shock quickly curdled into rage. His face, usually a mask of bored superiority, flushed a deep red. "Do you have any idea who I am?" he hissed, his voice low and menacing. "I know exactly who you are," Clara replied, her voice just as quiet, but ringing with a clarity that cut through the tension. "And in here, you're just a customer. One who is being loud, disrespectful, and is currently at the back of the line." The entire diner was now silent. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. Julian's friends Caden and Bryce had stopped smirking. They looked nervous, glancing at the door, as if plotting an escape. They had seen Julian's temper before. Julian's eyes narrowed into slits. He saw this not as a simple disagreement, but as a fundamental challenge to his existence. He, Julian Thorne, was being denied something. He laughed a short, ugly bark. "Let's try this another way," he said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick wad of cash, peeling off several $100 bills and throwing them on the floor between them. "For your trouble. Now get the geezers out of my seat." The money lay on the checkered tiles, a vulgar stain on the diner's simple decency. That was it, the final line. This wasn't about a table anymore. It was about human dignity. Clara looked from the money on the floor to Julian's smug face. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words were cold and hard as steel. "Pick it up," she said. What, he scoffed. "Pick it up," she repeated, enunciating each word. "And then get out of this diner. We don't serve people like you here. Your money means nothing." Julian stared at her, his jaw working silently. The public humiliation was more than he could bear. He was used to people cowering, apologizing, fawning. He was not used to being commanded. With a snarl, he lunged forward, not towards the money, but towards her. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like claws. "You're fired, you little." But the sentence was never finished. Reacting on pure instinct, born of years of protecting herself and her brother, Clara twisted her arm, with a sharp, practiced movement breaking his grip. With her other hand, she gave him a firm, decisive shove on the chest. It wasn't a violent push, but it was so unexpected and so perfectly balanced that the arrogant billionaire, caught off guard, stumbled backward, crashing into a stack of high chairs near the door with a loud clatter. Silence. Absolute pin-drop silence. Julian Thorne lay in a heap of plastic and chrome, his $1,000 suit jacket twisted his face a mask of pure, unadulterated fury and shock. Caden and Bryce froze, their faces pale. Clara stood tall, her arm throbbing where he had grabbed it, her heart hammering against her ribs. She pointed a trembling but resolute finger towards the open door. I said she announced, her voice ringing through the cavernous silence. "Get out!" Without a word, a humiliated Julian scrambled to his feet. He shot her a look of such venomous hatred it could have curdled milk, a silent promise of ruin. Then he turned and stormed out, his 2 lackeys scurrying after him like frightened rats. The bell on the door chimed softly as it closed, leaving a stunned diner in its wake. Clara stood there for a long moment, the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Then slowly, the enormity of what she had just done began to crash down upon her. She hadn't just kicked out a rude customer. She had kicked out Julian Thorne. She had declared war on an empire. The silence that followed Julian Thorne's chaotic exit was heavier than any noise. It was a vacuum filled with the unspoken fears of everyone present. The regulars stared, a mixture of awe and terror on their faces. The tourists looked like they had gotten a far more real New York experience than they'd bargained for. Chloe was still frozen by the coffee machine, her hands covering her mouth. It was Maria who broke the spell. She walked slowly from behind the counter, her face unreadable. She bent down, not with any sense of civility, but with a weary dignity, and picked up the $100 bills Julian had thrown. She walked over to the tip jar by the register and stuffed them inside. "That's for Chloe's college fund," she announced to the room, her voice firm. Then she turned to Clara, and for a terrifying second, Clara thought she saw disappointment in her eyes. She braced herself for the inevitable words. "You're fired. Do you know what you've done?" Instead, Maria gently took Clara's arm, turning it over to look at the red marks where Julian's fingers had dug in. "Go put some ice on that, honey," she said, softly. "I'll handle the floor." The simple act of kindness was almost Clara's undoing. The adrenaline began to recede, leaving a cold, creeping dread in its place. She retreated to the small, cluttered back office, her legs feeling like lead. She sank onto a wobbly chair, the enormity of her actions washing over her in nauseating waves. She hadn't just stood up for herself and Chloe. She had potentially signed the death warrant for the Gilded Spoon. A man like Julian Thorne didn't just get mad, he got even. He wouldn't key her car or leave a bad Yelp review. He would use the full, crushing weight of his family's fortune to obliterate whatever stood in his way. He would bury the diner in lawsuits. He would find out where she lived. He would discover her enrollment at Cooper Union and use his influence to have her expelled. And Liam. The thought of her brother so fragile and dependent on the stability she fought so hard to provide made her stomach clench with a visceral fear. For the next 2 hours, every time the bell on the diner door chimed, Clara flinched. She expected lawyers in sharp suits serving papers. She expected city inspectors suddenly finding a dozen violations. She expected Julian himself returning with a smug look on his face to watch the diner be shut down. The lunch rush ended. The afternoon lull settled in. Maria came into the office and sat down opposite her, placing a cup of chamomile tea on the desk. "You did the right thing," Clara Maria said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "I might have destroyed your business, Maria." Clara whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "He's a thorn. They don't lose." "There are things more important than a business," Maria replied, her gaze steady. "Respect, dignity. This place was built on that. If we lose it because we stood up for what's right, then so be it. We'll go down with our heads held high." Clara wanted to believe her, wanted to draw strength from her unwavering resolve, but the fear was a cold knot in her stomach. That evening on her subway ride home, she pulled out her phone and, against her better judgment, Googled Julian Thorne. The results were a sickening montage of tabloid photos, Julian on yachts with models. Julian stumbling out of exclusive clubs, Julian at charity galas, with his father, the formidable Alistair Thorne. Alistair. He was the real power, a man who had built a global empire from the ground up. He was often described in business journals as ruthless a visionary and intensely private. In every photo, he had an expression of stoic, unreadable calm. He looked like a man who could move mountains with a single phone call. He was the father of the man she had just publicly humiliated. Clara's tiny apartment felt less like a home that night, and more like a flimsy shelter about to be hit by a hurricane. She tried to study, but the words on the page blurred. The intricate designs of suspension bridges and cantilevered roofs seemed a world away. All she could see was Julian's face contorted with rage. She called her brother a nightly ritual. Liam's voice, though weak, was always a beacon. "How was your day, Clara?" he asked. "It was eventful," she said, trying to keep her voice light. "Just another day in the big city." "Did you ace that physics midterm?" he pressed. Always her biggest cheerleader. Still waiting on the grade, she lied, the guilt twisting inside her. She couldn't tell him. She couldn't add this worry to his already heavy burden. They talked for another 10 minutes about his physical therapy, about a new documentary he'd watched, about anything and everything except the storm that was gathering just over her horizon. The next day, Clara walked to the diner with a sense of impending doom. Every black car that passed seemed to slow down. Every person in a suit looked like a lawyer. She pushed open the door to the Gilded Spoon, her heart in her throat. The diner was quiet. It was the dead time between the breakfast and lunch rushes. Maria was behind the counter polishing glasses. She looked up and gave Clara a small, reassuring smile. Nothing had happened. Yet. The morning passed in a haze of tense anticipation. Clara went through the motions, refilling coffee, taking orders. But her senses were on high alert. At precisely 11:45 a.m., it happened. A car pulled up outside. But it wasn't a flashy sports car like Julian's. It was a long, impossibly black Mercedes-Maybach S680, a vehicle that whispered wealth rather than screamed it. The tinted windows were so dark they looked like polished obsidian. A chauffeur in a grey suit got out, opened the rear door, and stood at attention. Out stepped a man who could only be Alistair Thorne. He was older than in the photos, perhaps, in his late 60s, with a mane of silver hair swept back from a high forehead. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that cost more than a year of Clara's tuition. But it wasn't his clothes or his car that commanded attention. It was his presence. He had an aura of stillness, of immense, condensed power. Where Julian was a raging fire, his father was the cold, silent weight of a glacier. He didn't look angry. He didn't look at all. He simply walked to the door of the diner, the chauffeur holding it open for him, and stepped inside. The bell chimed. This time, It sounded like a funeral knell. Maria's hand, which was polishing a glass, froze mid-wipe. Chloe, who was setting tables, dropped a fork with a loud clatter. Clara, standing by the register, felt the blood drain from her face. The hurricane had arrived. Alistair Thorne's gaze swept the room, once taking in every detail of the worn-out diner. His eyes weren't disdainful like his son's. They were analytical, as if he were assessing a potential acquisition. Finally, his eyes, the color of cold steel, landed on Clara. There was no flicker of recognition, yet she knew he knew exactly who she was. He walked towards her, his expensive leather shoes making no sound on the tiled floor. He stopped a few feet away. His silence was more intimidating than any threat Julian could ever have uttered. Clara's heart was pounding so hard, she could feel it in her ears. This was it. The end of the line. She braced herself, ready for the explosion. Alistair Thorne looked at her for a long, silent moment. Then he spoke. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone, the sound of old money and absolute authority. He didn't say, "You're fired." He didn't say, "You'll be hearing from my lawyers." He said, "Miss Lawson, I'm Alistair Thorne. You and I need to have a conversation." The air in the gilded spoon grew thick, heavy with the unspoken power Alistair Thorne radiated. Maria began to move protectively towards Clara, but a subtle, almost imperceptible shake of Clara's head stopped her. This was her battle. She had started it, and she would see it through. Mr. Thorne. Clara set her voice surprisingly steady, despite the tremor in her hands. She met his gaze, directly refusing to be the first to look away. In his eyes, she saw none of his son's petulance, only an unnerving, calculating intelligence. "May we sit?" he asked. It was a question, but it had the weight of a command. He gestured towards the very booth his son had tried to claim, which was now fatefully empty. Clara nodded, her mind racing. What was his angle? A public dressing down, a meticulously planned legal threat delivered in person for maximum effect. She led the way to the booth, every nerve ending screaming. Sliding onto the worn vinyl opposite a man whose net worth could probably buy the entire city block, felt surreal. Alistair Thorne sat placing his hands palms down on the Formica tabletop. They were strong, clean hands that had clearly never washed a dish, but had undoubtedly signed deals that shaped skylines. He didn't seem to notice the small crack in the table or the faint stickiness from a long-gone syrup spill. He was entirely focused on her. "Maria," he called out, his voice calm but resonant. "Could we have 2 black coffees, please?" Maria, ever the professional, simply nodded and went to prepare them. The act of ordering coffee, so mundane and normal, was disorienting. It was a power play, Clara realized. He was establishing control, turning this into his meeting in his time. He waited until Maria had delivered the coffees and retreated to a safe distance before he spoke again. "I was given a rather colorful account of an incident that took place here yesterday." He began, his voice even. "My son Julian seems to be under the impression that he was grievously wronged." Clara gripped her mug, the heat a small, grounding comfort. "Your son was harassing my staff and treating other customers with contempt. When I asked him to leave, he refused and became aggressive." She decided against mentioning that he had grabbed her. Let him bring it up. She wouldn't sound like she was making excuses. Alistair took a slow sip of his coffee. He seemed to genuinely consider her words. "My son has a misplaced sense of his own importance, a symptom of a life lived without friction. He believes the Thorne name is a key that opens all doors. He has yet to learn that some doors, the ones worth opening, require a key of character. This was not what Clara expected. She had prepared for threats, for anger, for dismissal. Not philosophy. He threw money on the floor and demanded I kick out an elderly couple for him. Clara stated, keeping her tone factual. That's not a lack of friction, Mr. Thorne. That's a lack of basic human decency. A flicker of something, was it? Disappointment, respect passed through Alistair's steely eyes. Indeed, he said, nodding slowly. Decency. An undervalued asset in today's market. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze intensifying. Tell me, Miss Lawson, why did you do it? And don't give me a simple answer. I am not a simple man. The question hung in the air. He wasn't asking about the shove. He was asking about the entire sequence. The refusal, the confrontation, the defiance. He was probing her motives, looking for the bedrock beneath her actions. Clara thought for a moment, gathering her thoughts. She thought of Liam, of the quiet dignity of her regulars, of Maria's unwavering support. Because this place, she said, gesturing to the diner around them, matters. Maybe not to people like you or your son, but it matters. It's a community. People feel safe here. Respected. Your son walked in and tried to shatter that with his money and his name. He tried to make Chloe, a 17-year-old girl, saving for community college, feel worthless. He tried to make the Hendersons feel like their anniversary was an inconvenience. He wasn't just being a jerk, Mr. Thorne. He was trying to prove that his power meant their dignity was worthless. She took a deep breath, the words pouring out now. I didn't do it because I'm brave or reckless. I did it because if you let someone like that chip away at the decency of a place, it rots from the inside out. And I won't let this place rot. Not for any price. Alistair Thorne was silent for a full minute. He stared into his coffee cup as if the secrets of the universe were swirling in the black liquid. Clara's heart hammered. Had she said too much? Had she just insulted him by proxy? Finally, he looked up and his expression had changed. The cold, analytical mask had softened, replaced by a look of profound, weary gravity. For 30 years, he said, his voice dropping to a near-confessional tone, I have tried to teach my son that lesson. I have tried to explain that our name, our wealth, is not a shield for bad behavior, but a responsibility. It is a tool. It can be used to build great things, or it can be used as a club to beat people into submission. He has consistently chosen to see it as a club. He sighed a sound that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul. I have failed. My son is a disappointment. He has a brilliant mind for numbers and acquisitions, but the foundation is cracked. He lacks a moral framework. He paused, then looked directly at Clara. You, Miss Lawson, possess that framework. You have a foundation of solid bedrock. I saw it on the security footage. Clara froze. Security footage? Of course, Alistair said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. My security chief had the footage from this diner's camera within an hour of the incident. I saw the entire thing. The condescension. The money on the floor. I saw him grab your arm. And I saw you defend yourself and your establishment with a composure I have not seen in my own boardroom. He leaned back, a calculated move. The interrogation was over. The proposition was about to begin. I did not come here to apologize for my son, Miss Lawson. An apology from me would be meaningless, and I did not come here to threaten you. That would be beneath me. I came here with an offer. Clara's mind braced for it. A check. A non-disclosure agreement with a hefty payout to make this all go away. I am flying to check on a new construction project upstate this afternoon, he said. A complex cantilevered design for a new corporate retreat. I'm told you are a student of architecture at Cooper Union. Clara's breath caught in her throat. How did he know that? Of course. A man like him could find out her blood type in 5 minutes if he wanted to. The helicopter leaves from the West 30th Street heliport in 1 hour. He continued, ignoring her shock. I want you to come with me. I want to show you the project. I want you to look at the plans. And I want to continue this conversation where we won't be interrupted. Clara was speechless. It was the most bizarre, unexpected twist she could have possibly imagined. A helicopter ride to see an architectural project. Was this a bribe, a threat disguised as a reward? A test? Why, she finally managed to ask her voice, a hoarse whisper. Alistair Thorne stood up, placing a crisp new $100 bill on the table, enough to cover 2 coffees 1,000 times over. Because Miss Lawson, he said, his steel-grey eyes locking onto hers. People with foundations as strong as yours are a rare and valuable commodity. I want to understand what you're built from. The helicopter leaves in 1 hour. A car is waiting for you outside. He turned and walked out of the diner, leaving Clara in the booth, her mind reeling the scent of expensive cologne and the impossible weight of his offer hanging in the air. She had an hour to make a choice that she knew with absolute certainty would change her life forever. The 60 minutes Alistair Thorne had given her felt like both an eternity and a split second. Clara's mind was a maelstrom of conflicting thoughts. One voice, the voice of caution and fear, screamed that this was a trap, a powerful, angry billionaire luring her to a secluded location. It was the plot of a thriller, not a real-life opportunity. He could be planning anything to intimidate her, to threaten her family, in a place where no one could hear her scream to force her into signing a document that would ruin her. But another voice, the voice of her ambition, the one that had pushed her to apply to Cooper Union against all odds, whispered that this was the chance of a lifetime. Alistair Thorne wasn't just a billionaire. He was a master builder. Thorne Global Properties was at the apex of architectural innovation. To see a project of that magnitude, to speak with the man who commissioned it, it was an opportunity that most architecture students could only dream of. It was a glimpse into the world she was fighting so desperately to enter. Her eyes fell on Maria, who was watching her with a worried expression. "What do you think?" Clara asked, her voice barely audible. Maria wiped her hands on her apron. "I think men like that don't make offers without a reason. He's not interested in your opinion on architecture, honey. He's interested in you. The question is why. Be careful. A lion may praise a sheep, but it's still a lion." Maria's words were wise, but they also held a challenge. Clara had never been a sheep. She looked at her reflection in the dark coffee. She saw a tired waitress in a cheap uniform, but inside she was the architect of her own life. She had to be. For Liam. With a deep breath, she stood up. "I have to go." She ran to the back, shrugging off her apron and grabbing her worn backpack, the one that held her sketchbook and pencils. It felt like a shield. She was no longer just a waitress. She was an architecture student. She was going to meet him on her terms. The black Maybach was still idling at the curb, a silent, imposing beast. The chauffeur, a man with the impassive face of a bodyguard, opened the door for her, without a word. The interior was like a private jet, plush leather-polished wood, and a silence so profound it felt like being in a different dimension from the noisy street outside. The ride to the heliport was a blur of traffic and anxiety. Clara's heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs. When they arrived, Alistair Thorne was waiting, standing beside a sleek black Augusta-Westland AW-139 helicopter, its rotors beginning to spin with a low, powerful thrum. He had changed from his suit into a more casual but equally expensive cashmere sweater and slacks. He looked less like a corporate titan and more like a king surveying his domain. "Punctual, another valuable asset," he commented as she approached, handing her a pair of noise-cancelling headphones. The flight was an experience in sensory overload. As the helicopter lifted off, the familiar grid of Manhattan sprawled below her like a living blueprint. It was the city she loved, the city she dreamed of shaping, seen from a perspective of incredible power and privilege. She could see the iconic skyscrapers, some of which bore the Thorne name, piercing the clouds. It was intoxicating and terrifying. Alistair pointed out landmarks not as a tour guide, but as a general reviewing his territory. Through the headphones, his voice was a calm, clear presence in the roaring chaos of the rotors. "Look there," he said, pointing to a new, impossibly thin residential tower near Central Park. "Engineered support structures. We had to sink caissons 200 feet into the Manhattan schist. A foundation problem. Everything Miss Lawson always comes back to the foundation." Clara found her voice. "The lateral load must be immense. You'd need a significant tuned mass damper to handle the wind shear at that height." Alistair turned to look at her, a genuine spark of surprise in his eyes. He had expected a passenger. He had gotten a peer, however junior. "We do. A 600-ton pendulum. You've done your reading." "I'm not just a waitress, Mr. Thorne," she replied, her confidence growing. In this realm, the realm of design and structure, she wasn't out of her depth. They flew for another 20 minutes, leaving the city behind for the lush green expanse of the Hudson Valley. They finally descended towards a clearing in a dense forest where a stunning structure was taking shape. It was a building of glass, steel, and dark wood that seemed to jut out from a granite cliff face suspended over the trees below. It was daring, beautiful, and a breathtaking feat of engineering. They landed, and as they walked towards the construction site, Alistair began to talk. He spoke of stress points and materials, of the challenges of building on a sheer rock face, of the interplay between light and shadow. Clara listened enthralled, interjecting with questions about the structural integrity and the environmental impact, her sketchbook already in hand, her pencil flying across the page. They stood on a temporary platform overlooking the valley, the view majestic. The air was crisp and clean. It was a world away from the greasy air of the Gilded Spoon. "What do you think?" Alistair asked. "It's audacious," Clara said honestly. "It defies gravity. It's a statement." "And what is the statement?" he pressed. "That with a strong enough anchor," she said, looking at the massive steel bolts drilled deep into the cliffside, you can build anything. You can reach out into the void without fear." Alistair smiled, a rare, genuine smile that briefly transformed his severe features. "Precisely. And that Miss Lawson brings me to the real reason we are here." He turned to face her, the wind whipping at his silver hair. The pleasantries were over. The test had arrived. "I have an offer for you, and it has nothing to do with a helicopter ride." I am prepared to pay for the remainder of your tuition at Cooper Union. All of it. Furthermore, I am offering you a paid senior-level internship at Thorn Global Properties, working directly with our lead design team. You will have access to projects and minds that will put you a decade ahead of your peers. I will also take care of your brother's medical expenses. All of them. In their entirety. Clara's world tilted on its axis. Every single one of her burdens. Tuition. Liam's health, her future, was being lifted in a single sentence. It was a rescue, a golden ticket, a dream so fantastical she couldn't have dared to imagine it. Her mind instantly went to Liam, to the relief, the freedom from worry this would give him. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she remembered Maria's words. A lion may praise a sheep. What's the catch? She asked, her voice shaking slightly. What do you want from me in return? Alistair's smile vanished, replaced by that same look of intense, serious gravity from the diner. I want you to work on a project for me. A rehabilitation project. He paused, letting the weight of his next words sink in. The project is my son. You will be placed on Julian's team. He is overseeing a new development in Hudson Yards. You will be his subordinate, officially. You will report to him. But your real report will be to me. I don't want you to be his friend. I don't want you to be his teacher. I want you to be exactly what you were in that diner, an unmovable object. A standard of integrity he cannot bully, he cannot buy, and he cannot break. He took a step closer. I have given my son every advantage, every tool except for one, a worthy adversary. A consequence. I believe that forcing him to work alongside someone who has already stood up to him, someone who owes her position not to him, but to me, someone who embodies the character he so desperately lacks. It might be the only chance he has left to build a foundation of his own. Clara stared at him horrified. It wasn't a golden ticket. It was a sentence. He wanted to use her. He wanted to put her in a cage with the very man who had assaulted and humiliated her, and he wanted to watch what would happen. He was offering to save her life, but the price was to step back into the lion's den every single day. You're asking me to be bait, she said, the words tasting like ash. I'm asking you to be a benchmark, he corrected, his voice cold as the steel bolts in the rock beside them. I'm offering you the world, Miss Lawson. Your future, your brother's health. In return, I need your strength. The choice is yours. The wind on the cliffside was a wild, clean thing, whipping at Clara's worn jacket and clearing her head. Before her stood a man who held the keys to a kingdom she had only ever seen from the outside, and he was dangling them right in front of her. The structure they had just toured, a breathtaking marriage of audacity and engineering, seemed to pale in comparison to the structure of the offer he was now building in the air between them. I am offering you a path, Miss Lawson. Alistair Thorne, said, his voice a low counterpoint to the rushing wind, one that bypasses the years of struggle, of debt, of fighting for recognition. I am prepared to fund the entirety of your remaining tuition at Cooper Union. Not a loan, a grant. Furthermore, I am offering you a paid senior-level internship at Thorn Global Properties. You would not be fetching coffee. You would be working alongside our lead design team on the Hudson Yards redevelopment. You will have access to resources, minds, and projects that will place you a decade ahead of your peers. Clara's world, which for years had been a precarious balancing act on a knife's edge, suddenly felt solid under her feet. The words washed over her, each one a balm on a deep, persistent wound. Tuition paid. The crushing weight of debt, the constant fear of not being able to finish her degree, vanished. Paid internship. An end to the grueling double life of waitress and student, an end to choosing between a new textbook and a decent meal. She saw for a dizzying second a future unburdened by financial terror. Then he delivered the final heart-stopping blow. I will also assume complete financial responsibility for your brother's medical care. All of it. The treatments, the consultations, the hospital stays. Whatever he needs from whomever he needs it, wherever in the world that may be. That was the moment her defenses crumbled. The image of Liam, not gaunt and tired in his small bedroom, but healthy and vibrant, flooded her mind. The constant sickening knot of dread in her stomach, the one that tightened every time the phone rang with a call from a doctor or an insurance agent, simply dissolved. Tears, hot and immediate, sprang to her eyes. It was a rescue. A miracle delivered by this cold, calculating man. It was too good to be true. She looked at him, her heart overflowing with a desperate, burgeoning hope. This man, for whatever reason, was her savior. She remembered Maria's warning, a faint echo from another lifetime. A lion may praise a sheep, but it's still a lion. Her nascent gratitude was tempered by a sliver of caution. Why she finally managed to ask, her voice thick with emotion. No one does something like this for nothing. What is the catch, Mr. Thorne? What could you possibly want from me in return? Alistair's expression remained unreadable, but a subtle shift occurred in his posture. The benevolent benefactor retreated, and the ruthless strategist returned. The warmth of the offer receded, replaced by the chill of a transaction. I do in fact require your services for a project, he said. A rehabilitation project of sorts. A structure that has been built with the finest materials, but suffers from a profoundly flawed foundation. He paused, letting the architectural metaphor settle before delivering its true meaning. The project is my son. The air rushed out of Clara's lungs. The beautiful future he had just painted cracked and shattered like fragile glass. What are you talking about? She whispered, though she already knew. You will be placed on Julian's team for the Hudson Yards project. Officially, you will be his subordinate, a junior member of his staff. You will attend his meetings. You will take his direction. Alistair explained, his tone clinical. But your true purpose will be different. Your real report will be to me. I don't want you to befriend him. I don't want you to counsel him. I want you to be precisely what you were in that diner, an unshakable standard. A presence of integrity. He cannot bully, he cannot buy, and he cannot break. He took a step closer, his shadow falling over her. I have spent a fortune and a lifetime trying to instill character in him. I have failed. I believe that forcing him into close professional proximity with someone who has already bested him, someone whose position is owed entirely to me, and is therefore untouchable by him, someone who embodies the principles he scoffs at, it may be the only chance he has left to develop a moral core. Clara stared at him, a cold, sickening horror creeping up her spine. This wasn't an act of generosity. It was an experiment, a cruel, manipulative game where she was the primary instrument. The helicopter, the architectural tour, the life-altering offer, it was all an elaborate prelude to this. He wanted to use her trauma, her strength, as a tool to fix his broken son. You're asking me to be bait, she said, the words tasting like ash. The image of Julian's face contorted with rage as he grabbed her arm flashed in her mind. He wanted her to willingly walk back into that. "I'm asking you to be a benchmark," he corrected, his voice sharp. The horror curdled into fury. "No." She said the word, a small explosion. "Absolutely not. Do you have any idea what you're asking? That man assaulted me. He humiliated my friend. He is a walking embodiment of disrespect and entitlement. You want me to sit in an office with him every day, to subject myself to his arrogance and his temper, to wait for the moment he decides to lash out again. You aren't trying to build his character. You're using me as his punching bag." She expected him to be angry to rescind the offer. Instead, he simply watched her, his expression one of detached analysis. "Your reaction is precisely why you are the ideal candidate," he said calmly. "You see him for exactly what he is. You are not intimidated. I am not a lab rat." "Mr. Thorne," Clara shot back, her voice rising, "and my life, my brother's life, is not a pawn in your twisted family drama. The answer is no." She turned, ready to walk away, to find her own way back to the city, to her old life of struggle, which suddenly seemed infinitely preferable to this gilded cage. "Systemic lupus erythematosus," Alistair said, his voice stopping her dead in her tracks. "Your brother's specific diagnosis, it's particularly aggressive. The current regimen of corticosteroids is managing the symptoms, but causing long-term damage to his bones and organs. Your insurance provider, Aetna, has twice denied the claim for the experimental immunosuppressant therapy at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester. The therapy via Lumab has shown a 70% success rate in clinical trials for patients with his specific genetic markers. The out-of-pocket cost for the first year of treatment is approximately $580,000. Clara slowly turned back to face him, the fury drained out of her, replaced by an icy dread. He hadn't just done a background check. He had done a complete dissection of her life's most vulnerable point. He knew the name of the drug. He knew the clinic. He had laid her soul bare on a spreadsheet. It was the single most violating act she had ever experienced. "I had my office make inquiries this morning." He continued, his tone relentlessly impassive. "Without that treatment, his prognosis is managed decline. With it, he has a significant chance at a full and lasting remission. A normal life." He paused, delivering the final crushing blow. "The choice of whether he receives that treatment is now yours." It wasn't an offer. It was a hostage negotiation, and her brother was the hostage. The fight went out of her, leaving a hollow space filled with despair. He had her. He had cornered her so completely that every path of refusal led to a cliff's edge of guilt she could never survive. To deny Liam this chance for the sake of her own pride was unthinkable. She had always been his protector. She would not fail him now. She stood there for a long moment, the wind whipping around her, the silence stretching. In that silence, something inside her shifted. The despair began to burn away, forged by the heat of her anger, into something hard and resilient. Steel. If she was being forced into this game, she would not play it as a pawn. She would rewrite the rules. She lifted her chin, her eyes now dry and fierce, meeting his. "If I agree to this," she said, her voice low and controlled, "it will be on my terms, not yours." Alistair raised a single silver eyebrow, a flicker of genuine curiosity in his eyes. "I'm listening." First, she began ticking the point off on her finger, as if she were outlining a blueprint. "I am an architect in training, not a spy. My reports to you will be delivered weekly via email and will pertain only to project milestones, professional conduct, and the integrity of the work. I will not report on his personal life. I will not be your source for gossip or emotional drama. You will get the facts, nothing more." An efficient and professional arrangement, Alistair conceded with a nod. "Agreed." Second, my professional autonomy must be guaranteed. While I may sit below Julian on an organizational chart, I will have a direct and unimpeded line of communication to you and to the chief architect, Ms. Eleanor Vance. If your son attempts to sabotage my work, bury my designs, or professionally marginalize me, I will not be silenced by a chain of command that he controls. A wise and necessary stipulation. "Granted." Third, she said, taking a breath and steadying herself for the most crucial point. "And on this, there is no negotiation. The arrangement is terminated immediately if Julian Thorne resorts to any form of physical intimidation or targeted abusive harassment. The moment he crosses that line, the one he already crossed in the diner, I walk. And your commitment to my brother's lifelong medical care remains. It becomes an irrevocable trust. That part of our deal must be unconditional ironclad and drafted by a top-tier contract lawyer of my choosing whose fees you will cover." She had laid it all out. She had taken his cold, manipulative offer and forged it into a shield. She had demanded respect, autonomy, and a safety clause that put the onus of failure squarely on his son while protecting the one thing that truly mattered. Alistair Thorne was silent for a long moment, studying her. The analytical mask was gone, replaced by a look of profound, undisguised astonishment that slowly bloomed into a broad smile. Then he laughed. It was not a polite chuckle. It was a deep, booming laugh that seemed to echo across the valley. "Magnificent," he declared, his eyes shining with genuine admiration. "Absolutely magnificent. I bring you to a cliff's edge, leverage your family's health, and present you with an impossible choice. And you don't just surrender, you counter-negotiate with the precision of a seasoned attorney. You build your own fortifications." He shook his head in wonder. "You, Miss Lawson, are the real deal." He extended his hand. "You have a deal, on every single one of your terms. Draw up the list of lawyers. My office will be in touch." Clara looked at his hand. Shaking it no longer felt like a surrender. It felt like an armistice, a treaty signed between two formidable powers. She placed her hand in his, and his grip was firm and final. A contract with the devil had been signed, but she had managed to write her own clauses in the fine print. The flight back was different. The city that sprawled below was no longer just a dream. It was a battlefield she was about to enter, armed with a billionaire's backing and her own unshakable will. Her last shift at the Gilded Spoon was a haze of poignant goodbyes. When she explained to Maria that she'd been offered an unbelievable internship, the older woman hugged her, her embrace smelling of cinnamon and strength. "I knew he saw fire in you, Clara," Maria whispered fiercely. "Just don't let that world of cold glass and sharp edges put it out. Remember the warmth of this place. Remember what you're made of." The next Monday, Clara rode a silent, brushed steel elevator, 60 floors into the sky. She stepped out into the cathedral-like quiet of Thorne Global Properties. It was a universe of polished concrete, seamless glass walls and hushed, focused energy. The only sound was the distant hum of the city below. After a brief orientation, she was led to a sleek white desk in a vast, open-plan space. Her eyes scanned the area, and then she saw him. Julian Thorne stood across the expansive room, leaning over a holographic model surrounded by his team. He looked confident, powerful, and utterly at home. He was a prince in his castle. Then his gaze swept across the office and snagged on her. The confident smile on his face froze, then melted away. His posture straightened his body, going rigid with disbelief. Clara watched as a kaleidoscope of emotions flickered across his face, utter shock, then confusion, which quickly curdled into a dark, familiar rage. He wasn't just looking at a new intern. He was looking at the living ghost of his most public and profound humiliation, inexplicably resurrected in the heart of his own empire. Clara held his gaze. She didn't smile. She didn't scowl. Her expression was one of placid, professional neutrality. Inside, her heart hammered against her ribs, but her exterior was a mask of calm resolve. She gave him a single deliberate nod, a minute almost imperceptible gesture of acknowledgement, a colleague to a colleague. The message, however, was as clear as the glass walls surrounding them. "I'm here. I'm not a waitress anymore. You don't control this, and I am not afraid of you." Julian's jaw tightened, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of the table. To everyone else, it was just a new employee starting her first day. But to the two of them, it was the opening bell of a war no one else knew had been declared. The game had changed, and Clara Lawson had just walked onto the board. Clara's story isn't just about a single act of defiance in a diner. It's about what happens next. It's a gripping reminder that true strength isn't about the power you're born with, but the character you build when you're tested. She stepped out of her world and into the lion's den, not as prey, but as a force of nature in her own right. This is where the real drama begins, a daily battle of wits and wills inside a corporate empire, with a brother's life and her own future hanging in the balance. Can integrity survive in a world of cutthroat ambition? Can a broken heir be rebuilt? Or will he try to destroy the one person who sees his cracks? If this story resonated with you, if you believe in the power of standing your ground, then please help us share it. Hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs a story of courage, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. The next chapter of Clara's journey is one you won't want to miss. A deal worth $500 million hung in the balance, trapped in the gilded silence of a private dining room. On one side of the table sat two of the most ruthless executives in the tech industry. On the other, an enigmatic Japanese millionaire, Elara Vance, who refused to speak a single word of English. They saw her silence as weakness, her foreign words as nonsense. They smirked, they whispered, they belittled her, confident in their superiority. They believed they were in complete control. What they didn't know was that their every sneer and every lie was being watched by the one person in the room. They never even noticed the waitress. The air in the private dining room of Aurelia, one of downtown Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants, was thick enough to be cut with the sterling silver knives laid on the table. It was an atmosphere of forced patience, a palpable tension simmering beneath a veneer of corporate civility. The room was a statement in itself. Walls paneled with dark, polished mahogany, a crystal chandelier that dripped light onto the table like frozen tears, and a single vast window offering a godlike view of the sprawling city lights below. On one side of the expansive table sat Richard Sterling and Marcus Thorne. Richard, the CEO of Sterling Innovations, was a man in his late 50s with a mane of silver hair that looked meticulously sculpted and a smile that never quite reached his cold, calculating blue eyes. He exuded an aura of old money and unshakable power. Beside him, his vice president of acquisitions, Marcus, was a younger, sleeker version of the same predator. His suit was sharper, his smile wider, but his eyes held the same hungry glint. They were here to close the deal of a lifetime, the acquisition of Vance Robotics, a Japanese firm at the forefront of bio-integrative AI. And on the other side of the table was the reason for their anxiety. Elara Vance. She was not what they had expected. Her name, Vance, was from a brief, long-ago marriage to an American academic, but her entire being was a portrait of Japanese grace and austerity. She was perhaps in her late 60s, her posture ramrod straight, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a simple, elegant knot. She wore a modest dark silk dress, unadorned with any jewelry, save for a simple jade ring. Her face, a mask of calm impassivity, gave away nothing. Accompanying her was her trusted aide, a younger man named David Chen, who sat slightly behind her, his expression a perfect mirror of his employer's stoicism. The problem began the moment she arrived. After the initial greetings, facilitated by David, Elara Vance had spoken. But her words were not the crisp, accented English they were prepared for. They were Japanese, soft, melodic, and utterly incomprehensible to Richard and Marcus. "Mr. Sterling, Ms. Vance is pleased to be here and appreciates you hosting this dinner." David had translated his own English impeccable. Richard had forced a laugh. Of course, a pleasure. Please tell her we are honored." As the appetizers were served, a delicate arrangement of seared scallops and yuzu foam, Richard tried again. "Ms. Vance, your work in neural interfacing is simply revolutionary. We believe that combined with our global distribution network, we can change the world." He paused, beaming, waiting for the translation. David leaned in, murmured to Elara in Japanese, and she responded with a short, quiet phrase. David turned back. "Ms. Vance understands the potential synergies." The conversation, if it could be called that, continued in this stilted, frustrating manner for nearly an hour. Richard and Marcus would deliver a paragraph of enthusiastic corporate flattery, which David would condense into a whisper, receiving a one-sentence reply that he would then translate back. It was like trying to play tennis with a brick wall. Marcus was losing his patience. He leaned towards Richard, cupping his hand to his mouth in a poor attempt at subtlety. "What is this, Richard? Is this some kind of power play? Forcing us to go through him for everything she's making us beg?" Richard's smile was tight, a mask of professionalism cracking at the edges. "Stay calm, Marcus. This is how they do business. It's about respect hierarchy. Just play the game. The prize is worth $500 million. But it felt like more than a game. Elara Vance's eyes, dark and intelligent, seemed to follow their every move. She rarely looked at David when he translated, but instead watched them, her gaze unwavering. It was unnerving. She would occasionally say something directly to them, a stream of Japanese that sounded like a question, her head tilted slightly. Each time they would look at David with panicked helplessness. "She asks if you enjoyed your recent holiday in the Caribbean, Mr. Sterling." David would translate, his face unreadable. Richard would blink, caught off guard. "Oh. Yes, it was wonderful, very relaxing. How did she—" "And she notes that your company's stock fell 2 points this afternoon after the quarterly projections were leaked, Mr. Thorne." David would continue relaying another of Elara's soft-spoken observations. Marcus's face would pale slightly. They were being dissected, analyzed. and the woman holding the scalpel was speaking a language that rendered them completely powerless. Their frustration was curdling into a dangerous mix of anger and arrogance. They were the titans of industry here, not her. This was their city, their restaurant, their deal, and they were being made to feel like fools. Chloe adjusted the crisp white apron around her waist, her movements practiced and silent as she moved along the periphery of the private dining room. She was a ghost in this opulent world, trained to be invisible. Her job was to anticipate needs before they were spoken to, refill a water glass the moment it dipped below halfway, to clear a plate with the stealth of a cat, to exist as a pair of hands, not a person. But Chloe was a watcher. It was how she survived not just the grueling shifts at Aurelia, but life. She noticed the slight tremor in Marcus Thorne's hand as he reached for his wine, a sign of agitation he was trying to suppress. She saw the way Richard Sterling's affable smile was a thin, brittle shell over a chasm of impatience. Most of all, she watched Elara Vance. To Richard and Marcus, the woman was an obstacle, a bizarre, foreign enigma. To Chloe, she was something else entirely. She was familiar. Chloe had grown up in Kyoto. Her father was a cultural attaché at the American Embassy, a quiet academic who had fallen in love with the country and raised his daughter there for 15 years. She had attended a local Japanese school, her days filled with the rigorous cadence of the language, her friendships forged in its nuances. Japanese wasn't just a second language to her. It was the language of her childhood, of scraped knees and first heartbreaks, of whispered secrets with her best friend Aiko. It was the language she still dreamt in, sometimes. Now working 2 jobs to pay her way through a fine arts degree at NYU those years felt a lifetime away. Here she was, just Chloe, the quiet waitress. No one knew that the soft flowing words spoken by Elara Vance were as clear as day to her, and what she heard made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. She heard the translations David Chen provided, and they were accurate, but they were also incomplete. They were literal. They were the sterile, functional words of a professional interpreter. What they lacked was the soul, the subtle honorifics, the intricate subtext that was woven into every syllable Elara Vance spoke. When Elara had asked about Richard's vacation, her tone hadn't been merely inquisitive. There was a layer of polite, almost surgical precision, a phrase that subtly implied, "I know you were conducting unofficial business on that trip." When she had mentioned Marcus's stock, dropping her choice of words was not just an observation. It was a delicate yet unmistakable expression of disappointment, the kind a teacher might use for a promising student who had failed a simple test. She was speaking in a highly formal, almost courtly dialect of Japanese one that conveyed immense authority and intellect. Chloe watched as Marcus, growing bolder with his frustration, launched a new tactic, a condescendingly simple English spoken loudly, as if Elara were deaf or simple-minded. "We are offering you a very good price," he said, holding up his fingers. "Lots of money." Chloe flinched. The insult was so profound, so deeply ignorant, that she felt a phantom sting of shame on his behalf. She saw Elara Vance's eyes for a fraction of a second flicker with something that looked like pain. Not anger, but a deep, weary sadness. David Chen's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, translating Marcus's boorish words dutifully. Elara responded, her voice still quiet, but with an edge, a sharpness that wasn't there before. David translated, "Ms. Vance understands the financial offer." But what Elara had actually said was, "Please tell this child that the buzzing of a fly is more disruptive to my thoughts than his shouting." Chloe nearly dropped the silver water pitcher she was holding. She steadied herself against the wall, her heart hammering. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a disaster. These men, in their blind arrogance, were dismantling a $500 million deal with every condescending word. And Alara Vance was letting them. She was observing their disrespect, cataloguing it, her silence a vessel for their contempt. The final straw came when Richard, convinced that the woman across from him was either playing a foolish game or was genuinely incompetent, decided to discuss strategy with Marcus openly, right at the table. "Look, this is going nowhere," Richard muttered, leaning across the table as if Alara and David were merely furniture. "Let's just get to the final offer. We'll cut out the performance incentives for her executive team. She clearly can't manage them if this is how she behaves. We can absorb them into our own structure and save 20 million off the top. She'll never even know the difference. Just tell her it's a streamlined final offer." Marcus grinned, a flash of predatory teeth. "Brilliant. She's lost in her own world. He'll just translate whatever we tell him to." Chloe stood frozen by the service door, the cold metal of the handle pressing into her back. They were going to defraud her, right here in front of her, using her own childhood language as a shield for their deceit. They assumed her inability to speak English equated to an inability to understand complex deal structures. They saw a woman, not a titan. They saw a foreigner, not a genius. And in that moment, Chloe felt the 15 years in Kyoto rise up in her. She remembered her father teaching her that silence in Japan could be a sign of respect, of deep thought, of strength. It was not a vacuum to be filled with noise and arrogance. She looked at Alara Vance's face, at the profound, lonely intelligence in her eyes. It was the same look she'd seen in her own grandmother's eyes, after her grandfather passed away, a woman surrounded by people who only saw her as a frail widow, not the pillar of strength she was. Her manager's voice echoed in her head. "You are invisible, Chloe. Do not speak to the guests unless spoken to. Ever." It was the cardinal rule. Breaking it meant instant dismissal. It meant rent wouldn't get paid. It meant her dream of finishing her degree would evaporate. But then she heard Alara Vance speak again, her voice almost a whisper. And this time it was not directed at the men. It was a soft, forlorn murmur almost to herself. "Is there no one here who sees—" Chloe's decision was made. Her job, her future, they felt small compared to the colossal injustice unfolding in this gilded cage. She pushed off the door, smoothed her apron, and walked toward the table, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. As Chloe approached the table, the world seemed to slow down. Each step on the plush Persian rug was a deliberate act of defiance. The clinking of cutlery, the low hum of the city outside, everything faded into a muted background buzz. All that mattered were the four figures at the table locked in their tableau of misunderstanding and deceit. Richard and Marcus didn't even notice her at first. They were too busy smirking at each other, confident in their scheme. David Chen's head was bowed slightly, a portrait of resignation. Only Alara Vance's eyes lifted to meet Chloe's. For a fleeting second, Chloe saw a flicker of surprise in them, a momentary crack in the serene facade. Chloe stopped not beside Richard or Marcus, but at a respectful distance from Alara's side of the table. She took a slow, deep breath, the sterile, air-conditioned air, feeling thin in her lungs. This was it. She bowed. Not a deferential servant's nod, but a deep, formal bow from the waist, the kind she hadn't performed in years. It was a bow of profound respect, one reserved for an elder, a teacher, a person of immense status. The gesture was so unexpected, it sliced through the room's tension. Richard and Marcus stopped talking, their heads snapping in her direction. "What the hell is this?" Marcus muttered, a sneer twisting his lips. "Can we get some more wine here? Or—" His voice trailed off as Chloe straightened up, looked directly at Elara Vance, and spoke. Her Japanese was flawless. It was the Kyoto dialect of her youth, formal, humble, and clear as a temple bell. "Vance-sama." She began using the highest form of address, one that bordered on reverence. "Forgive my unforgivable impudence. I am but a humble servant here. However, to stand by and witness this discourtesy is a stain upon this house and my own honor. If you would permit me, I can help." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a stunned, deafening void. Richard and Marcus stared at her, their mouths literally agape. It was as if a piece of furniture had suddenly recited Shakespeare. This girl, the one who had been silently refilling their water, who they hadn't given a second glance, was speaking the very language that had been their wall of frustration all evening. David Chen's head shot up, his eyes wide with disbelief. He looked from Chloe to Elara, his professional composure completely shattered for the first time. But the most profound reaction came from Elara Vance herself. The impassive mask she had worn all night crumbled. Her eyes, which had held a universe of lonely wisdom, welled up with sudden glistening tears. Her lips parted slightly, and a small, choked sound escaped her. It was a sound of immense, soul-shattering relief. It was the sound of a prisoner who, after years in solitary confinement, finally hears a voice speaking their native tongue. She responded to Chloe, her own voice, thick with emotion, yet still retaining its innate elegance. You understand?" She asked, her words a fragile whisper. "You understand what has been said?" "The meaning behind the words. I understand everything." "Vance-sama." Chloe replied, her own voice steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through her. "I grew up in Kyoto. I hear not only your words, but your heart." This exchange, lasting no more than 10 seconds, completely reconfigured the power dynamic in the room. Richard and Marcus were no longer in control. They were outsiders, locked out of a conversation that was suddenly flowing with more genuine emotion and meaning than anything they had managed in 2 hours. "What is she saying?" Richard demanded, his voice sharp with suspicion. He pointed a finger at Chloe. "Who are you? What did you say to her?" Chloe did not look at him. Her attention remained entirely on Elara. She was no longer just a waitress. She was a conduit, a bridge over a chasm of cultural ignorance. Elara. Vance, with tears now tracing silent paths down her cheeks, gestured a frail, elegant hand toward the empty chair beside her. It was an invitation, an order. She spoke again, a short, clear sentence in Japanese. David Chen, finally finding his voice translated for the bewildered executives, though his eyes were fixed on Chloe with a look of awe. Miss Vance requests that the young lady join them at the table." Marcus scoffed in disbelief. "Join them? She's the waitress. This is insane." But Richard Sterling, for all his arrogance, was a man who understood power, and he could feel it shifting in the room as surely as a tide. The quiet Japanese woman was no longer a passive object. She had found a voice, and that voice belonged to the girl in the white apron. He fell silent, watching his mind racing to calculate this new, impossible variable. Chloe hesitated for only a moment. Then, with a quiet grace she didn't know she possessed, she pulled out the chair and sat down. The world had just turned upside down, and somehow she was at its center. Seated at the mahogany table, the fine linen of the napkin feeling alien in her lap, Chloe felt a profound sense of surreality. The crystal glasses, the ornate silverware, the half-eaten plates of Michelin-starred food, they were artifacts from a world she served, not one she inhabited. Yet the gaze of Elara Vance anchored her, imbuing her with a purpose that dwarfed her anxieties. Richard and Marcus watched their faces a mixture of confusion and fury. This was a flagrant breach of every protocol they understood. "I think we deserve an explanation," Richard said, his voice dangerously low. He addressed David Chen, but his glare was fixed on Chloe. "What is going on?" Before David could speak, Elara addressed Chloe directly in Japanese, her voice now calm and imbued with a quiet authority. Chloe listened intently, then turned her gaze to the two American executives. For the first time, she spoke to them, her voice clear and measured. "My name is Chloe. Ms. Vance has asked me to translate for her." She paused, letting the simple statement land. "She feels it is time for you to understand the full context of this meeting." David Chen nodded slowly, giving Chloe his tacit permission. He understood. His role as a purely professional translator was insufficient for what was needed now. What was needed was a human connection. Chloe turned back to Elara, who began to speak. She didn't speak of business of robotics or stock prices. She spoke of a rainy Tuesday in Tokyo 6 months ago. She spoke of a black car, a slick road, and the screech of tires that was the last thing she remembered before waking up in a world of muted colors and confusing sounds. As Elara spoke, Chloe translated her voice, becoming a vessel for the older woman's pain and frustration. 6 months ago. Chloe began her words, painting a stark picture in the opulent room. Ms. Vance was in a serious car accident. She sustained a traumatic brain injury, specifically to the parts of her brain that control language processing Broca's and Wernicke's areas. She paused. Richard and Marcus exchanged a look of disbelief. "Her cognitive functions," Chloe continued, the words flowing through her memory, her intelligence, her brilliant engineering mind, "they are all perfectly intact. She is the same woman who built a global empire from nothing, but the injury has caused a specific and rare form of expressive aphasia." Chloe took a breath, ensuring she conveyed the gravity of the situation exactly as Elara was expressing it. When she is under stress, her brain defaults. It reverts to its most fundamental pathways. For her, that is her native language. The English she learned in her 20s is inaccessible, a locked room in her own mind. The more she tries to force the words, the more they slip away. The story hung in the air, heavy and shocking. Elara Vance was not being difficult. She was not playing a power game. She was wounded. She was trapped inside her own brilliant mind, able to understand everything, but unable to command the language her audience required. "Why wasn't this disclosed?" Marcus blurted out, his tone more accusatory than sympathetic. "We've been wasting our time here." Elara's eyes flashed, and she spoke a sharp, single sentence. "Dignity is not a line item in a quarterly report." Chloe translated her voice as sharp as Elara's. Ms. Vance did not want to be defined by her injury. She did not want pity, nor did she want to be seen as a liability by the company she dedicated her life to building. This deal is not just an acquisition for her. It is her legacy. She has to know that the people she is entrusting it to are people of character, not just opportunists. Chloe's translation was imbued with the fierce pride she heard in Ilara's Japanese. She came here tonight to look you in the eye, to gauge your character, your patience, your empathy. She believes you can learn more about a person from how they act when they are confused than when they are comfortable. A wave of shame so potent it was almost visible should have washed over Richard and Marcus. Their condescension, their loud, slow-talking insults, their whispered conspiracy to cheat her, all of it had been a test they had failed spectacularly. But shame was not a currency Richard Sterling dealt in. He saw not a tragedy, but an opening, a weakness to be exploited. His mind, ever the calculator, was already re-evaluating the deal based on this new information. A vulnerable seller, a seller with a brain injury. He leaned forward, his earlier frustration replaced by a slick, predatory sympathy. Miss Vance. Ilara. My God, that's terrible. We had no idea. Please accept our deepest apologies. Of course we understand. And we want to help. His eyes gleamed. In fact, this makes everything so much simpler. We can take the burden off your shoulders. We can expedite the deal, handle the details, so you can focus on your recovery. There's no need to trouble you with the complex clauses and performance metrics. Marcus quickly caught on his expression, shifting to one of mock concern. Yes, absolutely. The last thing you need is more stress. We can sign a letter of intent tonight, a simple one, just to get the ball rolling, for your own good. Chloe felt a chill creep up her spine as she translated their words. She relayed the meaning, the sympathetic tone, but she also saw the truth behind their eyes. They were sharks that had just scented blood in the water. They weren't seeing a person to be respected. They were seeing a target to be taken down. Ilara Vance listened to the translation, her face unreadable once more. She then looked at Chloe, and in her eyes, Chloe saw a flicker of the same weary disappointment she had seen earlier. The test was not over. In fact, it had just entered its most dangerous phase. The dinner was no longer a dinner. It was a battlefield, and Chloe, the waitress, was now standing on the front line, armed with nothing but her understanding of 2 languages and a growing sense of dread. The air, which had briefly cleared with the honesty of Ilara's confession, was now thick with a new kind of poison predatory opportunism. Richard slid a leather-bound folder from his briefcase and placed it in the center of the table. It landed with a soft, definitive thud. This is our revised offer, he announced, his voice smooth as silk. It's simplified, much more straightforward. It accelerates the payout and places the operational transition entirely in our hands. It's a turnkey solution designed for your peace of mind, Ilara. He was using her first name now. The false intimacy was nauseating. Chloe felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. She was a fine art student. She knew about Renaissance painters and modernist sculpture, not leveraged buyouts and equity transfers. But she had to try. She had to be more than a mouthpiece. Ilara gestured for Chloe to examine the document. As Chloe picked it up, she felt the weight of it. The cold, smooth paper, filled with dense, legalistic text. She began to read the key clauses aloud to Ilara in Japanese, her voice slow and careful. As she did, she could feel Richard and Marcus watching her, their patience already wearing thin. Clause 7b, Richard interrupted, is a standard indemnity clause, just legal boilerplate. We can skip that. Section 12, Marcus added, just outlines the redundancy protocols for her executive team. It's really just a formality. They were trying to direct her to control the flow of information, But as Chloe read, certain phrases snagged her attention. She had spent enough late nights helping her diplomat father proofread documents to recognize the scent of deliberately obtuse language. "One moment," Chloe said, holding up a hand. She looked at Alara and switched to Japanese. "Vance Sama." They are glossing over these sections, but the language here is evasive. Clause 7b is not a standard indemnity clause. It appears to give their company unilateral power to renegotiate all of Vance Robotics' existing intellectual property licenses after the merger. They could sell off your core patents. Alara's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. She gave a slight nod for Chloe to continue. "And Section 12. Chloe went on, her heart pounding, "is not about redundancy. It's a non-compete clause. But it is written so broadly that it would not only prevent your top executives from working elsewhere, it would effectively prevent you personally from engaging in any related technological endeavors for a period of 10 years. They are trying to buy not just your company, but your future." Chloe was no longer just translating. She was analyzing. She was protecting. With every sentence she decoded, she felt a surge of adrenaline. The two powerful men at the table suddenly seemed smaller, their expensive suits and confident smiles, nothing more than cheap camouflage for their greed. Richard was becoming agitated. "What's the hold-up? What are you telling her? Just tell her it's a standard agreement." Chloe met his glare, her own expression unyielding. "I am ensuring Ms. Vance understands the full and precise meaning of every clause, Mr. Sterling. As you can appreciate, clarity is paramount in a deal of this magnitude." Her formal corporate language coming from a waitress seemed to stun him into momentary silence. Alara then posed a question in Japanese, her tone deceptively light. Chloe translated. "Ms. Vance is curious about the revised valuation of the company's R&D division. The initial offer had it pegged at $100 million. In this new document, that figure appears to be absent, folded into a general assets category." Marcus waved a dismissive hand. "It's a clerical simplification. The overall number is what matters. It's all in there, don't worry." Alara spoke again, her words soft, but carrying the weight of steel. Chloe's translation was precise. "Vance Sama says that in her experience, when a number of that size becomes silent, it is rarely for clerical reasons. She asks you to point to the exact line item where the value of her life's research is accounted for." A bead of sweat trickled down Marcus Thorne's temple. He and Richard began flipping through their copies of the document, a frantic rustling sound that filled the room. They were flustered. They had assumed their opponent was incapacitated, that the translator was a simple tool. They had never expected such surgical, informed questioning. They had never expected Chloe. Alara Vance sat back in her chair, a picture of absolute calm. She took a delicate sip of her tea. For the first time all evening, a tiny, almost imperceptible whistle touched the corners of her lips. She was not the wounded animal they had perceived. She was a hunter, and she had just watched her prey walk confidently into a trap of their own making. Chloe realized with a jolt that Alara's questions weren't just for information. She already knew the answers. She understood the contract perfectly. The aphasia affected her ability to speak English, not to read it. She hadn't needed a translator for the words on the page. She had needed one for the men in the room. She had needed a witness. The entire evening, the silence, the confusion, her apparent vulnerability, it had all been the most elaborate high-stakes character test imaginable. And now it was time for the final exam. The atmosphere in the room had transformed. The cloying scent of predatory confidence had been replaced by the acrid smell of panic. Richard and Marcus were whispering furiously to each other, their heads bent over the contract, unable to find the justification they needed. Their carefully constructed facade of control was crumbling into dust. Elara Vance watched them for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she looked at Chloe and began to speak. Her Japanese was different now. The soft, formal tones were gone, replaced by a voice that was crisp, commanding, and utterly resolute. It was the voice of a CEO, a leader, a woman who had bent the male-dominated world of technology to her will. Chloe listened, her eyes wide. The instructions were specific, the message devastatingly clear. She took a deep breath, straightened her back, and prepared to deliver the final blow. She turned to Richard and Marcus, whose frantic whispering ceased as they saw the look on her face. "Gentlemen," Chloe began, her voice ringing with an authority that was not entirely her own, "Ms. Vance has instructed me to convey her final decision." She let the words hang in the air, the silence stretching into an uncomfortable eternity. "First," Chloe said, her gaze locking onto Richard, "regarding your attempt to bury the intellectual property clause, Ms. Vance recognizes this as a blatant attempt to asset strip her company, effectively stealing the core technology patents that are the soul of Vance Robotics. She considers this not just a breach of good faith, but a profound personal insult." Richard's face went pale. "Second," Chloe continued, turning to Marcus, "regarding the deceptively worded non-compete clause. Ms. Vance finds it amusing. The suggestion that she would allow a man like you, who cannot even read his own balance sheet without leaking it, to dictate the terms of her life's work, is, in her words, the pinnacle of delusional arrogance." Marcus looked as if he had been physically struck. "And third," Chloe said, her voice dropping slightly, "regarding the deliberate obfuscation of the R&D division's value. That division is currently developing Project Chimera, a technology you are not even aware of, which has a projected market value far exceeding this entire company. Your attempt to acquire it for nothing is noted." The two men were speechless, utterly defeated. They had been outmaneuvered, outsmarted, and laid bare by the very woman they had dismissed as a confused old foreigner. But the masterstroke was yet to come. Elara spoke one final time, in Japanese, a short, simple phrase. As she did, her aide David Chen, who had been silent for over an hour, reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, sleek digital audio recorder. He placed it on the table and pressed a button. Richard's voice, tinny and distorted, filled the silent room. "Let's just get to the final offer. We'll cut out the performance incentives for her executive team. We can absorb them into our own structure and save 20 million off the top. She'll never even know the difference." Marcus's voice followed, dripping with contempt. "Brilliant. She's lost in her own world." The recording played their entire whispered conversation, every greedy, dismissive, and fraudulent word echoing in the opulent dining room like a death sentence. When it finished, a profound silence descended. Richard Sterling looked ashen, his silver hair suddenly seeming less distinguished and more like the mark of an old, tired fool. Marcus Thorne was staring at the recorder as if it were a venomous snake. And then the final miracle happened. Elara Vance looked across the table directly at Richard and Marcus. She leaned forward slightly, and in a voice that was quiet, raspy from disuse, but perfectly chillingly clear, she spoke her first English words of the night. "I believe," she said, her accent a faint, elegant melody, "this negotiation is over." The shock was absolute. It was a thunderclap in a silent church. The locked room in her mind had been opened. Perhaps it was the release of stress, the adrenaline of victory, or simply the sheer force of her will. But she had broken through the aphasia. She stood up, her posture regal. David Chen held her chair. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to Chloe, a gesture of immense gratitude and shared victory. Then, without another glance at the two ruined men, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving behind the wreckage of a $500 million deal and two careers that were for all intents and purposes finished. The sound of the door clicking shut was the loudest noise Chloe had ever heard. Of course, here is a rewritten and significantly expanded version of Part 7, delving deeper into the emotional and psychological aftermath for Chloe, drawing out the tension and making the life-changing offer a more detailed and profound moment. Chloe stood alone in the private dining room, a ghost in a gilded cage that had suddenly become a tomb. The silence left in Ilara Vance's wake was not peaceful. It was a physical presence, a high-pitched ringing in her ears that was the sound of her life teetering on a knife's edge. The rich scent of roasted duck and truffle oil now seemed cloying and decadent, the smell of a world she had just violated. Richard and Marcus had vanished, like apparitions, their panicked retreat, leaving behind a tangible aura of disgrace. They had left everything, briefcases agape, pens, and the fraudulent contract sitting squarely in the center of the table, a monument to their greed. The adrenaline that had sharpened her senses and steadied her voice began its cruel retreat, leaving a cold, trembling weakness in its place. She reached out and touched the back of the mahogany chair she had sat in the wood, still warm. It was the only thing that felt real. Had that all just happened? Had she? Chloe, a fine arts student who supplemented her ramen noodle diet by serving canapes to the 1% just committed career suicide in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. Her heart hammered against her ribs, each beat a frantic question. What have I done? What have I done? The cardinal rule, the one branded into every server at Aurelia, screamed in her mind. You are invisible. You are silent. You do not exist. She had not only existed, she had appointed herself judge, jury, and translator. The service door swung open with a violent slam, and her manager, a severe man named Mr. Dubois, with a perpetually pinched face, stormed into the room. His face was a mottled shade of crimson, his eyes blazing with a fury that made Chloe's blood run cold. Chloe, he hissed his voice, a low, dangerous weapon. He didn't shout. It was far more terrifying than that. Do you have any idea what you have just done? Chloe stood frozen, her hands clasped behind her back in a posture of ingrained servitude. Mr. Dubois, I can explain. Explain. He let out a short, incredulous laugh that had no humor in it. Explain what? How you decided to abandon your post. How you took it upon yourself to sit down. Sit down with a guest in the middle of a private dinner. I have Richard Sterling's chief of staff on the phone, screaming so loud I'm surprised the crystal in here hasn't shattered. He's threatening to sue not just you, but this entire restaurant for breach of privacy, for unprofessional conduct, for God knows what else. He advanced on her, his steps menacing on the plush carpet. Our reputation is built on discretion, on silent, perfect service. And you, in 10 minutes, have potentially destroyed it. You are fired, of course. That is a given. But I assure you, you will be so blacklisted in this city, you won't be able to get a job washing dishes in a back-alley diner. Pack your things. Get out of my sight. Each word was a nail being hammered into the coffin of her precarious life in New York. Her tuition payment was due in 3 weeks. Her rent was already late. The dream of one day curating a gallery of a life surrounded by art and beauty dissolved into a terrifying vision of eviction notices and crushing debt. She had acted on principle, on a deep-seated sense of justice, and this was her reward: ruin. As Chloe opened her mouth to speak, though she had no words to offer, the dining room door opened again, this time with a soft, deliberate click. David Chen stood on the threshold, his presence instantly commanding the space. His suit was immaculate, his expression utterly calm, but his eyes held a cold fire that made Mr. Dubois's theatrical rage look childish. "I believe you are mistaken," David said, his voice quiet, yet carrying an authority that sliced through the manager's tirade. He took a step into the room, his gaze fixed on Mr. Dubois. Miss Chloe was not acting on her own accord. She was acting on a direct and explicit request from my employer, Ms. Elara Vance. Mr. Dubois blinked, his momentum broken. "What? That's impossible. She was providing a service that neither you nor your esteemed guests were equipped to offer clarity and respect." David continued, his tone unwavering. He took another step, and the manager instinctively took one back. The power dynamic had been redrawn in an instant. "As for Mr. Sterling, I would advise him to be very careful about making threats. We have a recording of him and Mr. Thorne conspiring to commit wire fraud and contractual deception. My next call is to our legal team. His chief of staff will soon have far more pressing concerns than the conduct of a waitress." The color drained from Mr. Dubois's face. The name Vance, which before had just been a name on a reservation, now landed with the weight of a global corporation and its army of lawyers. David's attention shifted from the stunned manager to Chloe. The coldness in his eyes vanished, replaced by a genuine warmth and a profound look of respect that felt more valuable than any paycheck. "Ms. Vance would like to speak with you. She is waiting in her car downstairs. Please come with me." He said it not as an order, but as a gentle invitation. He then turned his head slightly towards Mr. Dubois. "See to it that her personal belongings are gathered and delivered to the address I will provide. She will not be returning." Without another word, he held the door open for Chloe. She walked past her former manager, who stood gaping like a fish, his authority utterly dismantled. She didn't look back. She walked through the bustling main dining room, where other servers and staff paused their work to stare whispering behind their hands. She was a curiosity, a scandal in motion. She felt their eyes on her back as she shed her white apron, folding it and placing it on a service counter, a final symbolic act of leaving that world behind. She followed David out of the gilded restaurant and into the cool, damp night air of Manhattan. At the curb, a sleek black Rolls-Royce was purring its engine, a barely audible hum. It wasn't just a car. It was a vessel from another dimension, a silent, imposing statement of power. David opened the rear door, and Chloe, feeling as though she were stepping into a dream, slid inside. The door closed with a heavy, satisfying thud and the chaotic symphony of the city. The swans, the horns, the chatter was instantly muted, replaced by an unnerving, profound silence. The interior was cavernous, smelling of rich leather and the subtle clean scent of jasmine. Across from her, illuminated by the soft glow of the cabin lights and the passing street lamps, sat Elara Vance. She looked tired, her face etched with a weariness that hadn't been there in the restaurant. The immense effort of the evening of maintaining her composure, of forcing her mind to reclaim a language held captive by trauma, had clearly taken its toll. She leaned her head back against the plush headrest. Her eyes closed for a long moment. When she opened them, they were fixed on Chloe, and they were filled with a deep, soulful gratitude. The silence Elara began her English quiet, but steady, each word seeming to cost her a small measure of energy. It is a very lonely place, Chloe. For 6 months I have been adrift in it. People either shout at me as if I am a fool, or they speak about me as if I am not there. Tonight, you gave me my voice back, not just by speaking my language, but by hearing what I did not say. Chloe was overwhelmed, twisting her hands in her lap. I don't know what to say, Ms. Vance. I thought I was going to be fired. I was terrified. I grew up in Kyoto. My father was a diplomat, and to hear them the way they spoke to you, the disrespect, I couldn't just stand there. Elara's lips curved into a soft, genuine smile. I know. I saw it in your eyes, long before you approached the table. I saw you flinch when Mr. Thorne shouted. I saw your jaw tighten when Mr. Sterling began his conspiracy. I was watching them, but I was also watching you. She leaned forward, her intensity filling the small space. The accident changed everything for me. It showed me how quickly the world can turn on you. The moment they sense a weakness, the sharks begin to circle. My company, the legacy I have built for 40 years, is vulnerable. I need to find a successor, a partner, someone to protect it. But how can I trust anyone's motives now? Everyone who approaches me sees either a victim to be pitied or an opportunity to be exploited. The world I have found is full of Richards and Marcuses. Chloe listened, captivated, understanding that this was more than just an explanation. It was an unveiling of the woman behind the myth. I find myself in need of a person of rare character. Elara continued, her gaze unwavering. This is not a job offer for a translator. It is an offer for a new path. I need someone on my personal staff who understands nuance, who values integrity over ambition. Someone who can be my eyes and ears, who can sit in a room and see not just what is being said, but what is being felt. I need someone to be my integrity check. She let the words settle, giving Chloe a moment to absorb them. I have a foundation, Elara said, her voice filled with a new passion. The Vance Foundation for Arts and Innovation. It funds 2 things that I believe are the pillars of the future: brilliant female engineers and daring young artists. It is my true legacy. I want you to work with me there, to help me find the next generation of creators and builders, to travel with me, to be my aide, my advisor, and my confidant. She paused again, a shrewd, calculating light, the one that had built an empire, returning to her eyes. I am aware that you are a student. Your education will not be interrupted. It will be underwritten. Your degree at NYU will be paid for in full, as will any graduate studies you wish to pursue anywhere in the world. You will be given a residence in my building, so you will not have to worry about rent, and you will be paid a salary that will ensure you and your family will never have to worry about money again. I am not offering you a job, Chloe. I am offering you a life, a platform, a chance to use your unique gift on a global stage. Chloe's mind was reeling. It was too much, too fast. Her tiny apartment with its leaky faucet, the mountain of student loan debt, the constant grinding anxiety of just trying to survive in the city, Elara was offering to wipe it all away with a few sentences. But it was more than that. It was an offer of purpose, of meaning. It was an invitation to step out of the shadows and into the light. The sheer scale of it was terrifying, a leap into an unknown, so vast she couldn't see the other side. "Why me?" Chloe whispered the question born of a lifetime of feeling ordinary. "I'm a waitress, an art student. I'm nobody." Elara reached across the space and for a fleeting moment rested her hand on Chloe's. Her touch was light, but it grounded Chloe in the surreal moment. Do not ever say that Elara said her voice firm, but kind. Richard and Marcus are somebodies. They have titles, reputations, fortunes. They see the world as a spreadsheet of assets and liabilities. They calculate, they leverage, they acquire. But they are blind. You see. You see people. Tonight you saw me when I was invisible to everyone else. That is not a skill you learn, Chloe. It is a fundamental part of who you are. And in my world, a world built on artifice and ambition, that gift is a superpower. I do not need another calculator in my life. I need someone who can see. Tears welled in Chloe's eyes, not of sadness or fear, but of a profound, overwhelming sense of being truly seen for the first time in her life. The years of being a quiet observer, of feeling like a ghost in her own life, had not been for nothing. It had all been training for this single moment. She took a deep, shaky breath, the air in the silent car, feeling charged with her future. She looked into Elara Vance's eyes and saw not a millionaire or a tech mogul, but a mentor, a kindred spirit. A new door was opening, and she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her soul that she had to walk through it. "Yes," Chloe said, her voice clear and strong. "Yes, Miss Vance, I would be honored." A brilliant, beautiful smile spread across Elara's face. "Elara," she corrected gently. "From now on, you will call me Elara." As she spoke, the car pulled away from the curb, gliding silently into the river of traffic. Chloe looked out the window at the towering skyscrapers of Manhattan, their lights twinkling like a galaxy of earthbound stars. Just an hour ago, she had been a tiny, insignificant speck in that vast, indifferent city. Now, as the Rolls-Royce moved through the night, she felt like she was finally on her way to becoming one of them. The journey was just beginning. What you just heard wasn't just a story about a business deal. It's a story about the masks we wear and the snap judgments we make every single day. It's about how we constantly underestimate the people around us, the quiet colleague in the office, the cashier at the grocery store, the waitress serving our table. We see a uniform, a job title, a silent exterior, and we fill in the rest with our own prejudices. But behind every pair of eyes is a universe of experience, a hidden strength, a voice waiting for the right moment to be heard. Elara Vance wasn't a victim. She was a queen testing her court. And Chloe wasn't just a waitress. She was the only one worthy of entering it. If this story moved you and reminded you of the extraordinary power of ordinary kindness and perception, please give this video a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more real-life stories that reveal the incredible truth that heroes are all around us, often in the most unexpected of places. Thank you for listening.